So this guy, the original guy wrote a book about it, and then a fellow just decided to reanalyze the bones, and come up with his own, he wrote his dissertation, or they call the PhDs a thesis, okay? And when I'm analyzing this, I'm like, this guy, I've met him, he still works there, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like, this is terrible, and here's why, okay? Even though he notes that this is probably not an entire population, right? Because we don't know who got buried in these tombs in Orkney, right? We don't think everybody did. He acknowledges that, but he still comes up with these kind of challenging conclusions, okay? So he finds a violence prevalence rate of 20%, okay? Now we're going to, when I get to the regional studies in a second, 20% is massively high for a prevalence rate of violence. And then he says, and I think it's 40%, okay? Even though he acknowledges that he has no idea who's actually put there, and says at one point in the thesis, it might be people who were victims of violence that got put in there. Well, if that's the case, then you lower your prevalence rate, you don't double it. Okay. Then he makes the argument that maybe this is because there were raids going on from the mainland, and that's why there was so much violence. Okay. This time period in Orkney, there's no evidence of defenses of any kind. Right. None of the villages, the settlements that have been studied, show any kind of ditches or walls or anything like that, except for the Ness of Brodgar, which I don't have time to talk about. And that wall that's considered kind of a ritual place, right? Nobody's ever discussed the Ness of Brodgar wall as being a defensive wall. But he makes the claim, well, we've got that wall at the Ness of Brodgar. One thing he does find is, again, the different diets for men and women with the isotope analysis. And it's clear that they do have different diets. So clearly this can suggest inequality, structural violence. But he jumps to the conclusion from the different diets of men and women that they were segregated, right? That women were kept over here, men hung out over here, and that he doesn't consider the alternative, for example, right? The other guy sees different diets, and he says, maybe it's this nutritional aspect, okay? Well, we have, this population, as I noted, shows all kinds of pathologies, brain deformations, skull deformations, physical deformations. If you have an unhealthy society, right, a group of people, nutrition might be one way of, trying to improve your birth rate and that kind of thing. He never considers that. Okay. The regional studies, this is basically, most of these have been done by Rick Schulting and Linda Feibiger. So what you have here is they do larger collections, right? They take all the bones from different areas. One of the big problems with these is that they also cover, 3,000, 4,000 years, and they don't make any distinction based on time. They suggest, many people in a lot of these studies suggest that violence was in fact endemic, but they don't discuss the possibilities, right? That a lot of the injuries that they're seeing, that they're calling violence, could have been from daily activities. These people live very hard lives, right? It's not like you plow the field, with a combine harvester, right, or whatever, right? These people are working hard all the time. And it isn't always that easy, right, to tell, right? Another thing about Isbister that's really interesting, it's right on a cliff, okay? And the first guy who studied it, he thinks that the people in Isbister would actually climb down the cliffs to steal eggs, right, from the birds to eat, right? Which probably meant they lost a few off the cliff, you know? So, you know, maybe some of these injuries are from falling off the cliffs, or just, I mean, these people in Orkney are building these massive tombs and their houses out of stone, right? You're gonna drop a rock on your foot. You know, it's gonna fall on you, whatever. Very little attention paid to that when they study this stuff. Anyway, I'm sure I'm out of time, but what we have going on here, at least Schulting and Feiberger, they give a prevalence rate for both Scandinavia and Britain of around 5 to 6%. And the data actually shows more than that, but their argument is some of this we can't really tell, right? They actually say high probability that it was violence, medium probability, low probability. And so they base their statistics on that. So, you know, that's much lower. I mean, that's still pretty high, actually, you know, but it's much lower than 40%. So those are some of the good things that they do. They also, in some of the studies, they jump to the conclusion, like in Britain, you know, oh, we've got missing women again, it's Talheim. They've been abducted, right? Well, we're talking like 2,000, 3,000 years later, right? The Neolithic came to Britain much later than it did to Central Europe. And they make these conclusions that, you know, what they're seeing is the same as what happened over there, but there's this massive time period, very different cultures in the things that they do. And eventually, both Schulting and Feiberger kind of back off of the abduction theory, and they also, because what they find, okay, this is what they find. Men show more evidence of anti-mortem violence. Women and men have equal rates of perimortem violence, okay? So this is my thought, right? You got men and women fighting with each other, probably the man's more likely to survive, right? Okay. Whereas a woman and a man, she's more likely to die, right? So maybe that's why you have equal numbers of perimortem versus unequal numbers of antemortem. But, you know, there's all kinds of explanations for it. And at least Schulting and Feiberger kind of get to that point, you know, and they say, you know, it's not necessarily this gendered thing, right? That violence is, you know, it's equal for the sexes. So, you know, my conclusions in terms of the dissertation was that way too many assumptions about agency and victimhood when it comes to gender. You know, women are never given agency. It's like, you know, we don't choose to go off and, you know, marry some guy or whatever you want, you know, whatever it is back then. We have to be abducted, right? And we're always the victims of violence. Most of them lack some kind of theoretical framework, either for the burials or the social structure. One of my professors, when I was giving this presentation, and I made this point, he goes, well, you know, those guys who study the LBK, they're just a bunch of, he said, I shouldn't say this, theoryless idiots. But he did say it. Lots of dating issues for regional studies, right, because you're covering 3,000 years. And another thing is there's a bunch of articles where they are, just from the title of the article, they tell you, we're looking for more like behavior. That's what they're looking for. And, you know, when you look for something, you can find it, right? So we need to pay more attention to the interpersonal and the structural violence. And that's pretty much it. Well, that's part of what we don't really know. We know, for example, that like there's recent studies on bones from Neolithic women that indicate, now that we're able to kind of tell how muscular they were and how strong they are, that Neolithic women are much stronger than every woman in this room, right? In fact, they're stronger than Olympic athletes, right? So these were hardworking, very strong women. So that doesn't help us, right? I mean, if these women are muscular and strong, maybe they are the ones out in the fields doing that work. But maybe they're out doing the hunting. You know, that's the problem. We don't have enough evidence. We don't know. Okay.
Covered so much of this. Comment. You have to name you an honorable archaeologist in the study. But it just was interesting to see the difference that you see in the cultures, because in the Mesoamerica, the women were very powerful there, and they were very much recognized in the cultural iconographic representations of women. Whereas you do see women in many other societies, of course, being very much diminished, especially compared to what we see with the figures of men. Oh. Okay, sure. But Kate was right very much that in terms of what we see with violence, a lot of it is not going to be recorded in the bones. And it's been estimated that over 70% of the violence that we see today, when people are going to places like the ER or wherever, that it's found in the soft tissue. But I will mention that there is some soft tissue that we do see are bug bodies, and sometimes things like monkeys.
Oh, lots of violence on them, yeah.
So sometimes you can find it represented there. And you're also right about the whole idea of it's very difficult to try to tell the cause of the injury that's found on the skeleton. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of anthropologists are kind of hesitant to try to do many of the studies. And part of, there was a student who was at Alabama, it was a number of years ago, but he was trying to come up with some sort of a model so that when you see an injury on the skeleton, you can try to determine whether it was intentional or whether it was accidental. And he was working with a group up in the northern part of Alabama, which is very known for a lot of violence and warfare taking place up there. And he was, now some of the markers you know, like if you have an embedded point in the bone, you're pretty sure, yeah. But then there's another thing that we talk about in forensic anthropology. Those are perifractures. I don't know if people have heard of those. And those are fractures to the ulna that you're supposed to get when you're being attacked, because you'll automatically hold up your arm to protect yourself. But if, like Kate said, they were working with a lot of rocks and they fell, they could hit their arm on the way down and it would look the same as a perifracture that you got from conflict. So those are some of the issues that you start to see. And then when you start to pull it all together, sample sizes get really tiny. Like you talked about that one that was, what, between 13 and 26? And many groups are that small. And so if you're only going to have a small number that are going to show any sort of evidence of trauma, it's difficult to try to come up with some sort of patterns that you can start to see manifest and then try to explain. And so this is one of the reasons that a lot of bioarchaeology really has not done much. We do it with the trauma, but in terms of trying to separate it on the differences that we see between males and females, it's almost non-existent. There also is another issue, and part of it is that when you talk about gender, that's a social connotation, whereas when we study the bones, we get the sex of the individual. And this is another thing that we talk a lot about, in the sense that we don't know who the perpetrators are. We always assume that the females are the recipient of the violence and the males are more often the perpetrators. How do we know that a male who shows signs of violence, maybe it wasn't warfare, maybe that person was, in terms of its gender, a female and undergoing the same sort of abuse that you might see with a person who also is biologically and gendered a female as well. But we don't take those sorts of options into consideration. We bring the ones that we bring from our own culture and trying to make a lot of explanations for what we are seeing. And we also have issues that a lot of times what is considered violence in another culture may not be considered what we call violence. Think about how many of you might have been spanked when you were a child, and I don't know that your parents would have called that violence under those circumstances. Plus, there's a whole issue of a lot of violence that we see, or we will call violence, can have ritualistic connotations to it. Sacrifice can be done to honor an individual, not necessarily trying to hurt that individual in the terms that we normally think of from a violent event in that regard. trying to interpret the bioarchaeological and the archaeological record very difficult in terms of trying to make any sort of broad statements about the violence that you might see. There was one study, though, and this is where those females might be, that they were talking about. It was a study that was done by Deb Martin, who was one of the bioarchaeologists who has done the most with trying to interpret violence. She was working with an Anasazi population in New Mexico dating to probably about 300 to 1300 AD. And there was a group of 65 individuals, and as in most groups, the largest segment were the children, because they will be dying regardless in that regard. But they had about 10 or 12 females. 60% of the females showed evidence of violence. Most of the time it was on the cranium and also on the postcranium, and a lot of it was antemortem as well as being perimortem. Only 20% of the males showed any sort of violence. And then they started to look more closely at the females. They also noted that the females were more likely to have different types of weapons that were used. And they said it wasn't just like a cudgel that might have been used by men in warfare. And it was all over the head. They also had broken noses, whereas the men tended to have more of just the blunt force trauma from a single type of weapon. They also noticed that the females, and this was interesting to me, when they were looking at the size of their arms, the arm bones on the right side, for a number of them, were markedly larger than the ones on the left side. And they assumed that that was associated with workload. So there was probably some sort of violence being done in terms of what was expected in terms of occupation between the two groups as well. And then when they looked at how they were buried, the women who had the violent evidence of injuries very often were in graves where it looked like they were almost pushed into the grave. Whereas the men were more like, even the ones with injuries, were more likely to be very carefully placed in the graves. None of the women had grave goods. The men had grave goods, even those that had signs of violence. And so what they were assuming is that the women may have been enslaved in some way or in showing signs of that. And we might be able to tell about that, because if they were raided, they could do the isotope analysis and see if the women came from another area and were brought back to that site. And so, just to close, because I know everybody is anxious to start their weekend or go to Faculty Summit. We do have a new field that's coming out in bioarchaeology, which is called social bioarchaeology, and it's much more cognizant of using social theory as opposed to just the biomedical theory, which has been the predominant framework to understand the bones. And they are using a lot more emphasis instead of on the population. They are looking at individuals, which is very good for violence because, again, it's not going to be the most common event that you're going to see in populations, but rather isolated incidences very frequently. And they are having a lot of new methods. And one of the methods that they're also looking at is the bioarchaeology of care, which would be interesting with your person who they thought was disabled, trying to figure out how they might have been taken care of. So the field is very much evolving in that way, and I'm looking forward to a lot of the results that are going to be coming out in just the very near future. So, well, thank you very much, everybody. And